Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. 1 year passes into another very quickly, not necessarily from one calendar year to the next, but from one cropping year to the next. With the harvest not quite over, there's still some beans to be cut, but oilseed rape is emerging on farms and planning for the next crop is well underway. With this planning process in mind, it's worth listening back to the recent Teagasc Tillage Forum, as topics discussed include variety choice, the influence of septoria on wheat, and grain market prospects for the coming year. We will listen to the questions and answers from each of the sections, and it'll give you an excellent insight into each of these topics. So I asked the questions of the panel, which comprised of John Joe Byrne from the Department of Agriculture, Stephen Kildea from Teagasc, and Phelim Dolan from Comex McKinnon. In the first section, I was joined by John Joe, Stephen, and Kieran. I first asked John Joe if the cold weather during the growing season had any effect on their trial plot results.
Yeah, particularly in the winter barley, I think there was an issue in terms of cold weather and malaria at certain sites. Followed on from that, there was definitely a stress relationship with some of that hard weather. In terms of oats, we didn't see any real dramatic differences between the varieties. We checked all our varieties shortly after that issue was identified, and we didn't come across those issues at our sites.
Okay, and just one follow-up one, there's a question here from Lisa who asks around the Kildea site in terms of winter wheat yield. It seems to be quite a ways back in comparison to the other sites. Is there any reason for that?
We haven't really put our finger on it. Kildea was always a high disease pressure site, so that's probably part of the explanation this year, that the year that was, the pressure was a lot higher. So similar to the Valley Around site, even with the fungicides, some of the varieties struggle to keep it together.
Okay, Stephen, can I come across to you? There's a bit of a question here around mixes of different varieties, and there's a bit more interest in that at the moment in terms of trying to include the Kruger maybe in with non-Kruger varieties. Is that something that is a possibility of something in the future for farmers?
I think, look, this is a question that is, I suppose, coming up quite often recently, and it's quite a difficult one to answer in terms of what do we. I suppose the question comes back to what are we trying to achieve with that mixture. If it's resilience, look, diversity, of course, will increase our resilience, and I think then we have to look at what type of resilience we're trying to achieve. Is it purely from a disease control perspective and the ability to reduce fungicides or manage our fungicides? And that then, of course, then is going to come back down to the varieties that are going to be included in the mix. Of course, it will have some benefit in lower pressure environments. I can very clearly see it. In the higher pressure environments down south, I'm not so sure whether it would have that major impact. And I think we'd probably still have to be reliant to some extent on fungicides down there to be able to achieve that. But definitely look, it is something that is becoming more topical and something that we will be looking at, and are looking at, I should say, at the moment.
And a follow-up question there around that as well, in terms of the selection of varieties, and obviously some of these aren't on the recommended list, but some of the likes of Astronomer and some of the other varieties with Kruger gene in are available this year. Are these varieties really going to be contained within kind of the northern half of the country, if you like? Are they suitable at all for the southern half?
I think where there's high disease pressure, look, and there will be some high disease pressure up the north, you'll have to be aware of that yourself, being honest. It is a risk, and it's about that risk management and how risk averse you might be. What I would say is, just because, and I'll sort of echo John Joe's words in terms of just because the crop looked very good this year, low, even you might regard as high disease pressure, I think these strains will move, and eventually they're going to find their way up there, and it will be a case of managing that risk. High pressure down south, I think the risk is too high, being honest, definitely.
So, Kieran, I would like to come to you and maybe ask that question in a slightly different way, in the sense of, rather than mixing varieties within the fields, the overall mix of varieties on farm in a general sense. You might give us an example about how that might work in practice for some of the larger growers.
Yeah, I suppose, Michael, anybody, as you say, a larger grower isn't going to grow one variety. And you're obviously, as Stephen says, to manage risk, you're going to need that. And I'd quote John Joe as well, there's no one variety that ticks all the boxes. So I suppose your location, firstly, is a big factor, and we've spoken about higher disease pressure down south. So obviously you're looking at something with a little bit more on septoria. But then if you look at yellow rust, now you will get yellow rust down south as well, but certainly it's going to be a higher pressure in the northeast, you know. So again, that's something that you have to look at. And then I suppose not to forget about sprouting, you know. There's two good varieties there with good yield. Spearhead new this year, but like it's susceptible to sprouting. And again, you just can't carry a lot of that in the system because you may not get the harvest weather to get through a big area of it. So for me, it's about managing risk, having that mix of varieties. If you wanted a very specific example, I think Graham and Costello complement each other very well. You know, you certainly have Graham, you know, better disease profile, especially in terms of septoria. But then if you get a wet harvest, and we do get quite a few of those, you know, you would be glad to have Costello in the system. You know, it's got good KPH, it's got excellent grain quality and good straw. You know, may not yield as high as Graham in a very good year, and not obviously as good in septoria, but they complement each other very well. So I think that's what you'd really be looking for certainly in a wheat scenario, Michael.
Okay. Thanks, Kieran. John Joe, just come back to you in terms of diversity. We have a question here around any plans to do hybrid rye in terms of trials?
Yes, it's something we're considering. I suppose we're going to see how it performs commercially for this coming season before we'll enter into it most likely next year when we'll start a trial program. I'm not sure how it has performed commercially, or is there any feedback locally from Kieran or yourself?
Yeah, I suppose the few crops that I've been in this year, a few farmers that have been growing it for a few years and they've got on very well with it. I suppose we've spoken about managing risk, and I think rye certainly does that. You obviously don't have that same disease pressure. We know that we can get very good yields of rye, and I think this year they've been reasonably good as well, to be fair. So I think it is a valuable alternative. I suppose, like always, you have to make sure that you have a willing buyer in your locality, and I suppose that's crucial. I suppose of my observations, disease obviously excellent, yield is excellent. Straw needs management, and a little bit like a sprouting variety, you can't have too much rye in the system, because if you do get a bad harvest, you know, any of the growers, it does break down. They all manage to cut it, but it certainly is slower. So again, it's a bit of management involved there. But yeah, I think it certainly has positives going forward, in my view.
Okay, a couple of final questions back to you, John Joe. One is around Ramillaria ratings. Are they going to appear on recommended lists going forward? And the other one then is around the untreated. You mentioned that as well. Is there any plans to publish untreated so people can get a good view as regards what the overall disease package looks like with no fungicides?
Yeah, on the Ramillaria, once we're happy we're getting a consistent picture, like the last thing we want to do is to put varieties down unfairly. Our colleagues in AHDB had Ramillaria scores and they removed them from their list. I think that they had question marks over how reliable those scores were. So on disease in general, we've moved across to 3 replications at our untreated trials to help improve the reliability of that data. So that we started that this year. So definitely from next year on, we should be able to start putting it together in terms of a recommended list rating. It might start to stand up. Up to now, there's been lots of inconsistencies across years. Maybe the other option is to put up the most recent year's data as a reference point, but it's pretty scary reading. But I suppose people need that scare at times when they're on that risk they're taking.
So in the final section, I was just joined by Phelim, and I first asked Phelim about the prospects of oilseed rape for the coming year.
Well, look, I think oilseed rape for the whole, for anyone that's growing it, is an absolutely good news story. I mean, it's an exportable cash crop. We don't, unfortunately, have a huge demand for it on the island here, and it's really too expensive now to be incorporated into animal feed. But there is a ready export market for it. It can be turned into cash. Yields, we've got better at growing it, I would say, and varieties have obviously improved as well. But yeah, look, super prices, and even looking forward into next year, quite good prices. I mean, we've bought oilseed rape for next year this week at €475. So I think really from a grower's point of view, plays a super part in the rotation. It generates cash. I would encourage more people to get involved in it if they can.
Okay. Another question here on what way is the malting Fab Creel market looking at the moment?
Malting market is quite firm. I don't follow the Fab Creel market particularly, but the cash price for Fab malting barley is quite strong for the moment. Look, there's obviously a problem in France, and I think everyone else in Europe is basically assessing what quality of barley they can make at the moment. I would think you may see more sellers coming into the market come late September, early October, as that situation becomes more certain. But for the time being, it's quite firm, mainly due to a lack of sellers.
Okay. Can I ask you one final question, because we're just up against time a little bit? Green grain for barley doesn't often breach €200 a tonne. There's probably a good bit of barley, I've gone into merchants, but certainly a good bit of barley gone into farmers' own sheds, either to be dried and stored. Are they best to try and get rid of that earlier rather than later? What way do you see the market? I mean, should they wait till January, February, March?
Well, look, I mean, it's very hard, to give a definitive answer to that. I mean, I think people have to decide what works for themselves best in terms of managing the risks in their own business. But I would always tend to, when talking to growers, to focus on, whether you can take a profit or not. And, no one ever went broke for taking profit. I do think the market, through next year is very, very, very hard to predict, because we can't forget the prices are already quite high. But, looking at the headline demand supply numbers, they're justifiably high. But I always feel that when you start taking the market for granted, you can very quickly get a slap on the jaw. And I just think if there's profit to be taken, there are downside risks here as well. And I certainly wouldn't encourage people to gamble everything they have in their shed.
Okay. One very final one. It's around sustainability and the availability of grain, I suppose, from around the world coming into Ireland. What way is the market looking at that, or are they looking at it more seriously, or maybe is there certain parts of the market looking at that sustainability, carbon bit, all of that kind of thing all in one? What way is that looking at the moment?
Well, look, I think from obviously sustainability and carbon capture in tillage farming, this is the way forward for certain. And it is going to be driven one way or the other. It's going to be driven by legislation. Look, the big brands in terms of the food and drinks industry, they certainly want to be associated with sustainability and possible carbon capturing in tillage farming. I suppose rather than sustainability, what people are talking now is regenerative farming. And look, from what I've seen, regenerative farming makes a lot of sense in terms of, possibly over the longer term, reducing your requirement for fertilizer, et cetera, I would say by and large, at this stage, the animal feed market is not so concerned with it. Look, they're happy enough to be associated with it, but are they prepared to pay a premium for it? I wouldn't say there's a queue to do that at the moment.
That's it for the Tillage Edge, and my thanks to John Joe, Stephen, Kieran and Phelim for the excellent update from the Crops Forum. A full video of the forum webinar can be found on the Teagasc Crops YouTube page. We have a couple of more events coming your way in the next few weeks. The first is a webinar focusing on winter malting barley, where we will discuss the latest trial results and how to get the best from your varieties this year. I'm also pleased to say we're getting back into the fields with a series of meetings focusing on autumn management on tillage farms. The events will be held on farm on Monday the 20th September in Cork, Tuesday the 21st in Tipperary, Wednesday the 22nd in Kildea. All of the events start at 11 a.m. except for Kildea, which starts at 3 p.m. The topics at the events will include autumn weed control, dealing with organic manures on farm, and other local topics. Registration is necessary for all of these events, and more details for all the events mentioned can be found at teagasc.ie/events. So finally, don't forget, if you like this podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and subscribe on Apple Podcast or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.